On behalf of the board, it is my very great pleasure to present our session today with EY on what directors need to know about the future of work. We have Robin Bew from our Center of Corporate Governance here, and one of our sponsors, along with our other sponsors that you saw listed earlier. EY is Utah's biggest sponsor. We're very happy to have them. And with that, Robin, I hand over to you to introduce the panelists and the session. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ted. Great to be with everyone, and we're looking forward to a great discussion today. Let me give, before we get into it, just a couple of comments on how the session is going to go. You can see our fabulous panel here that I will introduce in just a moment. Please put your questions in the chat, given our large and continuing to grow as people pop in group on the line today. Folks will be staying on mute. But we welcome questions, so just feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll be pulling those in as we go, and we'll also leave some time on the back end before we do final thoughts, just to also take questions from the chat. So feel free to add those there as we go. And as always, we're working with what we call a no attribution ground rule. We call it the modified Chatham House rule, which just says you're welcome to share good ideas, good takeaways that you hear today. We just ask that you not attribute them to any individual or any company, and that will allow us to have a good, candid conversation. And of course, we're all here speaking on our own behalf. No one is going to be sharing any material, non-public information in the conversation today. So with that, let me share a little bit about our panel, and you have all the full details in the invitation that went out from, and the information that went out from NACD. So we won't read everyone's full bios, but we have Kerrie MacPherson, who's a director at Spartan, Nash, Community Financial System, and Synechron. Mike Milligan on the boards of Portland General Electric, Axis, Capital, Vobis, Network Wireless Solutions, Vetted Inc., and my EY colleague, Rosalind Feinsod, who is a principal with our People Advisory Services practice. And to set the stage for us, I'm going to turn things over to Rosalind in a minute, just so she can share a couple of recent trends that her practice, she and her team are seeing in their work with our clients and in their ongoing research, and that'll sort of help put some context to our conversation. Rosalind?
Thank you. And I had the opportunity to join EY 6 years ago, just as a global health crisis was kicking off not that long thereafter. And so we've been doing research, and we survey over 17,000 employees. We survey 1,600 companies. And this visual summarizes our bottom line on top in terms of what we've learned. And we've learned that organizations and all of you are really looking to help organizations get to this concept of a talent advantage. But the bottom line is that the world is quite different in terms of the worlds of work than it had been before. And the things that organizations really need to manage are the things that are shown around the ring here. So these concepts of talent health, are our employees for the organizations that we serve, are they net promoters of what we do in our brand? Are they joining and leaving for the right reasons and from our anticipated places? How are the companies really creating a technology environment that is going to maximize productivity and use technology like Gen AI and the next versions of agentic AI, and where all of that leads us in the most effective and productive ways, so that our 9 to 5 plus experiences will match our personal experiences. We certainly continue as organizations to invest a ton in people, but are we really giving people the right mix of what they need in terms of total compensation and benefits? And are we doing that transparently with all of the pay equity pressures that we have? We know that the shelf life of skills keeps getting shorter and shorter. So are we giving people the right opportunities, both in terms of the experiences they have at work, the formal training, the training that we sponsor, to really develop their skills, keep them fresh and current, and then give them opportunities to advance in our organizations? And then finally, this whole concept of culture. So not just about the me and I would join, I would stay, I will invest my effort, but are the teaming in organizations and the leadership effective? And are people really able to bring their best selves to work, does wherever they work create that environment that is most productive, whether that's in a formal workplace and work site, or whether that is the virtual and distributed approaches. And then ultimately, if we do those things, we get to this concept of talent advantage. And we have on the next page just a few of the key stats around what we learned from the study, and then we'll jump into some more kind of examples from the others on the panel. We see that this concept of talent flow is not going away, that employees, while it is not quite at the peak that it was in the Great Resignation, literally 38% of employees might look to leave in the next year. We see this skyrocketing of the adoption of AI to 75% of people touching AI in some form, even at work, and lots that we need to address in terms of responsible AI and how that is leveraged. We do feel better about the productivity that we're starting to achieve from that. We're uncertain, though, around how our rewards are going to shake out. Are we supporting well-being, and are we meeting our employees' needs? There still is a core of people that are looking for more flexibility in terms of work location for the knowledge workers, and can we stay more remote, and are continuing to get optimistic about that culture is getting better, that we have the opportunity to better communicate. So a lot of really interesting stuff. We're all blessed in that we're living through that Chinese proverb of the interesting times. It has never been a more exciting time to be in board roles and to really need to understand the talent landscape and how that's going to impact your company performance. So with that, I will turn it back, Robin, to the team to just delve into this a bit more.
Super. Thanks, Rosalind, and thank you for setting the table for us there. And I think we'll be able to, I think, share these slides as part of the follow-up. I loved those questions in the yellow column on that second slide. I think they're great questions that that board members can be asking the management team. So we'll dig into that, but want to start by picking up on one of the comments you mentioned about the importance of teaming, the importance of bringing our entire selves to work, our best selves to work, and how that relates to culture. It's really kind of a foundational issue. And so, Mike, I'll ask you to maybe kick off with a couple of reflections here. The panel and I, we had a conversation, kind of a prep call a couple of weeks ago, and so want to tee up some of the great ideas that were shared during that conversation. And in that conversation, Mike, you talked a lot about the importance of trust, and also about wellness. And if thinking back to, again, if we're going to be bringing our best selves to work, trust and wellness are kind of critical to that. So could you talk a little bit about how your boards are, paying attention, and how they're leaning in on the question about how are we doing on wellness? How are we doing on trust?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm appreciative of being a part of this panel, and hopefully can bring some of the experiences that I'm exposed to out there. Every board that I'm on, whether it's a for-profit board or a not-for-profit board or a private board, this discussion of culture is on the table. And I think about culture from a perspective of alignment. Now, you mentioned the word trust. I'm an old HR person, unfortunately, back many decades, where this conversation of trust came up. And I've kind of learned that trust is a very difficult goal to achieve. And we could talk about that forever. But in the place of the workplace, and the boardroom, I think this conversation around culture and trust gets back to me along the lines of, how do we develop an alignment of goals, an alignment of expectations between our constituency, our employees, our customers that are out there, that brings us to this shared value position? What we do know, though, is that if we're not mindful and have a lens on culture itself, then the misalignment of culture could severely impact our ability to support, from the minds of the director, our goal of enhancing shareholder value, shareholder wealth in this case. And so culture is definitely an important foundation builder in order to enable anything that we want to accomplish inside of the boardroom overall. And so we do spend time thinking about the whole person that's being brought to the room. I think about the concept of shared values and valuing the differences that we have. And if we're not doing that, then obviously that we are operating on less than all 8 cylinders in this particular case. So we look at the risks and the opportunities that culture brings. We try to determine, do we have a lens inside of the organization where we can determine the effectiveness of culture? I'm a part of one board where when we received a new CFO, we went and developed a project called cultural renovation, meaning trying to determine whether or not the internal systems were aligned to each other so that we could create the output that we wanted to. And then lastly, for me, I have a CEO who is focused, quite frankly, on this issue of what we call a project healthy minds, making sure that people are able to bring kind of their healthy outlooks from a mental health perspective to the boardroom.
Great. Thank you. Kerrie, I'm going to bring you in here on the conversation we had the other day. You were talking about a couple of interesting points. One is around generational differences, and the other one is around, how can boards make sure that company leaders are focusing on the segment of managers that's always in that mix that are probably causing some of the cultural issues.
Absolutely. So listen, clearly one of the biggest shifts in organizations today is the fact that an ever increasing proportion of the workforce is younger. So the Gen Y, the Gen Z, and those people have started their careers in the last few years, and they have very different expectations about what they ought to be getting from their employer than previous generations did. And one of the most fundamental of those expectations is that flexibility, including some remote work, is part of the deal. And while many companies have mandated return to office of 3 days a week or more, there's no guarantee that the 3 days a week and employees in the office will match those of others on their team, or that they'll even be on the same floor. And so as a result, there's less physical connection to the workplace. And some would suggest less connection overall to the company. So organizations need to work hard to create connectivity among their employees and with the company. When so much work can be done remotely, there needs to be a draw to encourage people back into the office. And one of those draws is interaction with leadership. So that means leaders need to be around, they need to be visible. They need to deliberately interact with team members, both to support their professional development and to get to know them as people. For decades, studies have confirmed that the departures of employees that organizations would like to keep are most often related to an unsatisfactory relationship with their direct supervisor. Put simply, bad managers are really bad for retention. So companies need to understand which of their managers need to enhance their people leader skills, and be prepared to make tough decisions, especially if one of the bad managers is a rainmaker. So the board needs to understand, how is management monitoring and assessing the behavior of managers, the extent to which they're developing team members, and the board needs to understand what management will do about it when a big revenue generator is one of those people who's not living the values and not, to Mike's point, carrying the culture of the organization.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pick up on one of the questions in the chat, which was one of the other kind of hot topics we were wanting to cover, which is around thinking about the impact of technology transformation on talent, on culture, on the workforce strategy. And so, as we look back at the data that Rosalind shared, welcome, all of you, anyone who wants to chime in. What are the questions that boards, the compensation committees can be asking management about that impact of not just AI, but other types of technology transformation on the human capital strategy of the company? And how should AI evolve, as the question says? Thoughts there?
Yeah, look, I just came back from a trip down to the Bay Area, having a conversation with everybody who believes that AI is important to the success of their world. And what I can tell you is that the genie's not going back in the box. And so ultimately, this conversation around AI and how we operate in an environment of AI is something that I think we all need to upskill ourselves on. I was kind of surprised in a conversation that I was having this past week with one of the tech gurus that just indicated, how far advanced the progression of AI was, but culturally, going back to our culture question a minute ago, how AI in its development and its use could actually change the way we think about how we reward people, how we attract people, the type of people we attract in the future, how long we think they will actually be in the workforce, how do we communicate interdepartmentally with folks. It changes up the game in which how we operate internally as well as externally in the organization. And then I think that portends an opportunity to determine, at least from a perspective of what we're able to at least align ourselves with. How do we go about trying to accomplish it, and who do we involve in that? And then how does that really change our reward systems is a big question I have. I'm the chair of a comp committee, and I think about this question all the time about, is technology giving us some avenues to think differently about how we should reward people in the future. In our world, now we've taken an opportunity to say everybody's owners. And so if everybody are owners, but our tactical systems basically says that only a certain amount of people are going to be able to play the game, then we may have to change the way we think about how we reward people in the process.
Mike, I think another thing that's really important as we talk about the impact that technology and innovation is going to have, particularly as it relates to AI. One of the big questions is, how is this being communicated to employees? Mm-hmm. If all employees hear is, this is an efficiency move, we're going to save a lot of money, we're going to reduce SG&A, that's really not a particularly compelling message. And so I think we need to make sure that employees understand that part of the good that will come out of AI innovation is to reduce some of the things that they probably don't really like to do anyway. And then to give them the opportunity, if I have 2 more hours a day because I'm not doing something that was routine, how do I think I can best make a contribution to the organization? As opposed to just, we've saved you 2 hours, now here are 5 other tasks to do. So I think there really is an opportunity, back to your culture point, of engaging the employee base and asking them how we can best make use of this technological innovation. And then the other question I think the board needs to ask is, to what extent are people being reskilled?
And building on what both of you said, Kerrie and Mike, and bringing it home to HR, and I think one of the questions from Purvi in the chat around really making sure, AI, machine learning, these technologies will really have the potential to automate a lot of the more routine kind of types of things, plus even enhance the decision-making processes. And HR has to be at the forefront of really rethinking how work gets done combined with technology. HR for its own work has to use it. So it has to use some of the generative AI. How can it use it creatively to create training materials or performance feedback or recruiting materials and improve their own processes and work? And the RPA, or the robotic process automation, to really reduce the administrative tasks, and using data science to really understand what drives culture and engagement, or what drives retention, and assembling their own HR data. So lots of opportunities on the work process and even on the talent processes overall to really support then kind of better decisions about workforce.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Another hot topic that we had wanted to touch on, and I see Rocio, you've anticipated it with your question in the chat, so thank you. Which is, we wanted to spend a little time talking about the conversations that are happening in boardrooms now around DEI, whether that's things that are going on at the company level that the board is asking about, kind of broadly, at the leadership team level. Or also on the board itself. So, Mike, I'll turn to you first. That Rosie's question was directed at you, but would love to hear. Then we'll come to Kerrie and Rosalind. And I have a interesting anecdote to share from a roundtable I was at here in San Francisco last night. So, Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I think since the beginning of the year, I've seen this evolution of conversation of DEI in the boardroom. Some where people are scared to touch it, to be honest with you. Others where people are embracing it and basically saying, look, regardless of what we called it, when I grew up, we didn't call this stuff DEI at all. So, who puts a name on it, puts a name on it. But from the perspective of what we're trying to accomplish, valuing the differences between us, focus on strategic value. If the board started 3 years ago and said that we want to focus on this subject because it provides strategic value to this organization, then it should still be providing strategic value to this organization. What you call it is whatever. You shouldn't get hung up on that. And I know earlier in the year, folks were kind of concerned about, hey, we need to get rid of the acronyms, but the acronyms doesn't mean anything. It's the action that means something. It's the alignment of what the organization is doing. Now, keep in mind, as we think about alignment, it causes us to go back and do our homework and to say, now, why are we doing this? And truly, are there some business purposes for it? And if so, fine. If not, modify it. Let's move on. But for me, I think the big piece is this attraction of the workforce question and talent question, and it'll never go away. And I'm fortunate enough to have a young daughter who kind of keeps me in today's game, not my game. And she is still of the mindset of, hey, I'm not going to work for a company that doesn't value the differences of the people that are out there and can't find strategic value in this conversation. She's not hung up on what they call it either, but she is hung up on truly what the actions are. And I think boards are finding their way through the process on how to find the right types of way to gain an appreciation of the subject and commitment inside of the company, and then also pointing it outside the company to where it provides value, and we can show the linkage between shareholder value here and just our own ethos inside of our own company and what we believe in and then what we don't believe in.
Mike,
Well said.
I think that's right, and it's really important. And there are all kinds of examples. There were some, pretty big name companies who went silent on DEI very quickly, and have seen some pretty negative reactions as a result. And then the flip side of that is the CEO of Marriott on a panel was asked about DEI, and he said much of what you did. The letters don't matter. What matters is what we do. And the fact is, what we do is we want all of our employees to feel included, to bring their whole selves to work. We want all of our guests to be welcomed. And so whether we call it DEI or we just call it the way we do things at Marriott, it matters. And overnight, he got 40,000 emails from Marriott associates saying, thank you for reaffirming that this is important. So to your point, this matters to our employees. I think it matters to our shareholders and companies that use the current climate to say we're not going to do it or we're not going to talk about it. We'll do that at their peril.
Yeah, I think we run the risk sometimes, and not adequately understanding the temperature of the employee base. And if we're not careful, we can erode this, how we started this conversation, trust in the employee base around what we're all about. And employees could walk away amidst a lot of things that go on in corporations today, basically saying we have to tackle this problem by ourselves, and we don't have any support from an organization to try to accomplish that. And then I would just say, hey, just open up the lens and let's just make sure we're getting a good view of what's happening internally, and then truly tying it together to business values, which I think will stand the test of time.
Yep. Well, thanks. Just to add to that from a director roundtable that we had here in San Francisco last night. One thing that I shared there and will mention here is a little bit of a preview, a kind of preview. We do a post proxy season wrap up research publication every year. It's proxy season isn't all the way over yet, so it's going to come out probably over the summer. But one of the things we're going to be looking at a couple of things in this space. One of them is how boards' own disclosures about their responsibilities are changing. And I will say early returns are, we're looking at large cap companies. We're seeing a number of compensation committees. Again, it comes back to the points you both mentioned about are we using the acronym? Are we not using the acronym? We're seeing use of the DEI acronym under, compensation committees, oversight responsibilities dropping pretty precipitously. But comp committees are continuing to mention things like inclusion, belonging, culture oversight, talent, people oversight. So those things are staying. The other thing that came up in the discussion last night, which I guess was a little bit, we had a very similar conversation, and most of the folks in the room, we had about 20 directors in the room, said, our companies are again, maybe changing some language, but our actions and our policies have not changed. And our aim is to try to weave this into the DNA of our company and our board. But there were a couple of folks in the room who had a reflection that they shared, which I'll just share with this group, that they said, well, yes, and the acronym also isn't entirely inconsequential. And there was a little bit of a concern expressed by a couple of the folks in the room that hopefully we're not kind of seeding the narrative here. And there was a little bit of a concern that maybe, is something being lost if there needs to be, a retreat, even from an acronym or from a nomenclature. So the group didn't come out with a settled, kind of opinion on that, but it was really interesting to kind of reflect on, and several of the directors at the end of the dinner said, that this is something that they're going to kind of continue to reflect on. But again, coming back to the important point, and I see that in the chat, and Mike and Kerrie, you mentioned it, it's companies' actions that are really important and that are going to resonate with employees. I'm going to shift gears here and talk about succession planning. And Rosalind, maybe you could kick us off with a couple of examples of leading practices that you and the People Advisory Services team are seeing in the work that you're doing with our clients.
Sure. So I guess a couple of thoughts around leading practice. One of it is, don't assume that the successor has to be exactly the same as what you're doing today. And I think that's, some mistake. Well, I did this, but yet we've all been talking about technology and a more diverse workforce and all of these kinds of things. So those that are doing succession really well are really thinking about what are the critical capabilities that are needed in the future. And thinking about the succession from that perspective, not just sort of current state, but more future oriented in terms of critical capabilities. And through that thought also, you start to identify some gaps, right? It's not like every leader is kind of the perfect fit even for what you need in the future as all of this is evolving. So that would be kind of item number one. The other approaches we've been talking about, just in terms of thinking about the pipeline and what are the targeted development opportunities that can really accelerate that type of successor grooming so that we can really kind of build some of that capability from the experiences that we give someone opportunities to have and really develop internal candidates better so that, it can generate this pipeline of potential leaders. It can really promote and retain your high performers. And then, just give more certainty in terms of what that onboarding process is going to look like. And the last one, again, tying to what we were saying about culture, right? I mean, how you go about this really creates an opportunity to create a transparent process that builds an inclusive culture. And the way you do succession and the way you specify those requirements clearly and identify those really helps to promote a culture, both a culture of learning, a culture of inclusion, and will really, have so many good outcomes in terms of readiness for events, reduce recruitment costs, minimize revenue loss, and really create that talent advantage through better ability to retain your own folks and get alignment around what's needed for the future. So those are a few thoughts, hopefully, to kick off the group on succession. And we certainly know that's a hot button. We have 10,000 boomers that are retiring every day. And the question of where are these next generation folks going to come from as the Xers and boomers are moving around more than they have in the past?
Thanks. Kerrie, maybe start with you to bring you in here, and on the prep call, you talked a little bit about some of the things that your boards are doing around that pipeline and board oversight of how management is developing that pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all heard the adage that the most important decision a board makes is CEO. Closely followed, I think, by looking at succession, not just for that role, but for the next level, and I think increasingly for the level below that. And why, as you know, Rosalind teed up for us, this is the most career mobile generation of employees ever. And so it stands to reason that some of the people we think would be great leaders in the future may not be with our organizations when the time comes to promote them. So understanding the depth of bench a couple layers down is really important. And then also building off Rosalind's point, the board needs to understand specifically for those people that have been identified as next generation leaders, what are the development opportunities they need, and what is the management team doing to make sure they get them? And in my experience, the best organizations, managers have a people metric about the extent to which they're building the future leaders, and they're held to account for that. And as always, what gets measured gets more attention.
Right. Mike, what would you add?
I think they've said it. You know, for me, I'm a chair of the comp committee for one of the boards, and the notion around succession planning has taken, particularly around the CEO level, particularly interesting look, because just the tenure of public company CEOs has gone down, 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 down. The stress level is up, up, and up. And so it requires us, even when we think things are settled, to always be in constant motion around the whole succession planning process. And so it's a always on type of scenario when it comes to succession planning. Part of the challenge that we have is in peering down to the organization, we tend to not always have the best views of the talent and the pipeline internally and externally. And that takes some work. It causes you to rely, particularly in some cases, on some external partners in the process, but it also causes you to ensure that your own internal network inside of the board is providing kind of the constant temperature of what this situation looks like. So it's tough. It's a tough one.
It's tough. Yeah. How about any of you, any panelists have thoughts on succession planning at the board level? So again, if I just kind of come back to the conversation we've been having across this session around what technology is doing to kind of transform companies' business models, their strategies, the workforce, as well as a whole other slew of, you know, risks and opportunities that really weren't necessarily on companies' radar screens. I mean, if you go back to, you know, within the tenure of many board members, they as board members and throughout their executive careers probably were spending most of their time, if they were based, you know, in the US or Western Europe, in a world where, you know, the business environment was kind of characterized by global trade, open trade, kind of, you know, and just-in-time supply chains were really important. And now that world has changed pretty dramatically, and we may not be going back to the way it was before. And so thinking about the skills that you need in the boardroom, and kind of looking ahead. So welcome, you know, Kerrie or Mike or Rosalind, what any of you are seeing there.
Listen, I think board succession is more important today, perhaps, than it's ever been. In part because, Robin, as you said, the world is changing at a pace that's hard to keep up with sometimes. And frankly, there are way too many boards out there that think board refreshment means when somebody ages out, either because of their age or number of terms served, that you replace them.
Yeah.
And I think shareholders are becoming increasingly less satisfied with that as a view. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to first ask ourselves, am I still relevant to this board? What am I bringing to the table today that is useful? And somebody might have been a fantastic board member 5 years ago and may just not be the right person today. And we should have the intellectual curiosity and the honesty to say, yeah, this person did a great job for this company for a period of time, and that time is no more. And it becomes really important then that we are getting clarity around forward-looking. What does this company need? What does the CEO need in terms of guidance? What are the skill sets that we don't have? And I don't think most boards can't afford to give up a board seat for somebody who wears the technology hat or this hat or that hat. We all need to be athletes who can play at a number of things. And so being rigorous about what's the skills matrix and how do we fill that, and doing rigorous evaluations of board members annually is going to become increasingly important.
And building on what Kerrie said, I think the magic is really in the mix, right? And making sure that as the business needs evolve, that the mix of what the different board members bring to the table. And as Kerrie was saying, it's not linear, but it's got to be looking at that collective mix. And do we have the mix across people around, what are the hot buttons, and the continuing evolution of what is needed to help that organization weigh in on.
Yeah, and then in keeping with just one of the questions that I saw pop up and trying to answer your question also, Robin, whether it's middle management, whether it is top management, whether it's the board, given the ambit of AI and technology in itself, there's some upskilling that needs to occur in this process over time, because some of the same redundant activity, I can get 10Ks read in like 2 seconds with a summarization on it, with a voice, as I saw in California this week, with a voice or video playing it back to me. And that impacts kind of the way I think, kind of the way I react, and the necessary basis of background and understanding that I perhaps need to have, or people thought that I need to have going into this process. And so we do need to assess. I'm definitely on board with the notion of putting together a skill set matrix, and we manage through that. But on the other end, I think to jump ahead of this process, there are certain type of technologies that will enhance my ability as a director to be more efficient, to read through 700 pages in not 2 days, but now probably in 3 minutes. Is a huge enabler out there, and to have that level of expertise and the right types of questions that I could bring to the table. I think it is a disruptive type of opportunity that only benefits the shareholder, the boardroom interactions, and the collaboration across the room.
Huge benefit. This could be a future session topic. Note to NACD Utah. Maybe we'll have to talk about that. But we're starting to hear, Mike, just as you say, how some leading boards are starting to use AI technologies to be able to, shorten the preparation or do things like, hey, summarize for us the earnings calls of our 5 top competitors and what are the 3 things we need to know as the board. And not only does that save you all time as directors, it also saves your corporate secretary and their teams an enormous amount of time in pulling that analysis together to have better discussions in the boardroom. So really exciting. So another question I wanted to turn to that we talked a little bit about ahead of the session is, and it relates to, again, some of the themes that have come up around how do we think about how is the organization being prepared to do everything from steward a healthy culture and mental wellness, drive trust, value differences and make sure that that's communicated internally and externally, think about leadership and succession planning. That's and stay fit for purpose as in terms of upskilling and reskilling the employee base. That's a lot, Rosalind, on the CHRO's plate. And so when you look at your clients and some of the real standouts, what should board members be expecting from their CHROs in 2025 and 2026, 2027? What are some things that should be table stakes and maybe some things that you say these might be differentiators?
Sure. So we actually also just did a follow-up study to the Work Reimagined study that we called CHRO 2030 because of all of this dynamic change that is out there right now. And we spoke to 160 different executives. And what we cull down in terms of what is leading practice, and I'll kind of type that in the chat because I'm a visual person. So number one, which is maybe surprising, is this notion of being a business operator. So what is the expectation? The HR leader has to really understand in a new way, what are the financial and operational metrics? And then how do they play in terms of cost and productivity and performance, and really help drive that in the organization? So in that way, you might have thought of your HR leaders as business operators, but they should be business operators, and you need to hold them accountable to that, because again, they're driving one of your biggest investments overall, and they need to be owning that in a new way. The second, and again, surprising, because this is HR, this is not IT, but HR has to be a technology transformer, and they have to really make sure that they are enabling, embracing, integrating technology, and then also driving the behavioral side of technology and the employee engagement around that, as well as streamline the things that they do, because there's so much that they need to do as well, using technology differently, as we talked about before. And then the third one is maybe kind of more of the core that you might have expected, which is this concept of being a talent authority, right? So at the end of the day, they are your go-to person, but they have to really lead with urgency and prioritize this experience around, are people your advocates? What is this experience like? How do you leverage both, emotional intelligence combined with, fact, to really make sure that you're advocates for employee well-being in different ways. So again, I mean, these are sort of what we're seeing is kind of the new and evolving HR. So again, business operator, technology transformer, talent authority, and hold your organizations accountable to those three, because that is absolutely what leading practice has to look like for 2030.
A great punch list. Mike or Kerrie, what are you seeing in the CHROs that that your boards work with? What stands out to you as really leading edge?
So it's interesting. I hadn't yet read Rosalind's latest study. So I love these three titles. I think they're fantastic. So before hearing the titles, I would have said that the really great CROs operate as true leaders with their business partners, or partners with the other business leaders rather, and that they do that within the context of the business and driving the business. That they understand the importance of succession planning and really drive that through the organization. Initially as a coach, and ultimately as a cop, if some of the folks don't get with the program. And again, in the context of why building the right team is good for the organization and good for the shareholders. And then I think the best CEOs drive some version of a next gen talent program, identifying that next generation of leaders, identifying what skills they need, what development they need, and then putting in place a plan to make sure they get it, and they get it in as short a time as possible.
Thanks. Mike, what would you add?
I mean, mine may seem old school, but I think it's really new school. I think HR or CHRO should be the owner of the culture. And what I mean by that is that there are different impacts to programs, call it return to work, call it, technology upgrades, call it levers with the financial systems integration, call it pay practices or performance consultancy. But the CHRO needs to own this culture. And what I found when I was back in the business years ago is that everybody thought that they could do the CHRO job. And so consequently, it made it very difficult, because people were the most difficult part of managing a business, and folks didn't think about it that way. But ultimately, there were a lot of inputs, a lot of type of information that came the way of the CHRO that they had to discern and then obviously apply to the business overall to develop that end result. And again, I think the CHRO, in consultation with the CEO, has an opportunity to truly understand what are the true levers that we can put in place that are available for us to have success in the business. And so I just think that we had a conversation inside of one of our boardrooms around the conversation about how we work. And how we work was an integrative way of figuring out how we help this business become successful through our interactions, through not only our business partners, but also with the people that we work with on a daily basis. It was very important work.
Great.
The other last comment I would add to it, Robin, is just we talk about kind of CHRO in this sort of swim lane, and I think one of the things that all of us should be challenging all the functions to do is just how effectively are they working together. So read some of the headlines. Really interesting one of a CHRO that just became a CIO, and challenge those groups. I don't know if people saw that one, but challenge these groups to say, these should not be separate and mutually exclusive functions. These should be a cohesive, integrated team. And that's, I think, a high bar that is probably not what the current experience is today. And I think lots of opportunity, and where a lot of what we've been talking about is pushing the world to very quickly.
I saw that. If it's the same article, Roz, that I saw, it was a new role that this company, quite large company, created that's called the Chief People and Digital Technology Officer. And so that's sort of an interesting, possible path that we could see in the future. Maybe if we reconvene, this group in a couple of years, maybe there'll be a lot of those roles out there. I guess we'll find out. One question from the chat that I want to come back to, because it relates, Mike, to some of your and some of Kerrie and Rosalind's comments just now, is around the question was, how do you maintain a culture when there is so much remote work? So maybe I'll ask for some quick thoughts on that, and then we will turn to all of you for a final wrap-up comment. But first, any thoughts on that question of what are some things that companies can do? Maybe Rosalind, I'll ask you to kick off. In the world of remote work, hybrid work, something in between, what are some things that you're seeing leading companies do to maintain a healthy culture?
Yeah. I mean, so number one would be cameras on. People, if they see each other on video calls, if they consistently cannot see each other, yes, we might have the occasional large group call where it's just not working, and that's fine. But I think seeing the culture of cameras on, I think there's more insistence around that, and that's kind of number one. I think there is a lot more creative celebrations of moments that matter, and recognition. And I think part of that, has to be a more intentional approach. And then the third one is just making the office and the get-togethers like this on-site, off-site, where you want to just create experiences and programming in the office where people are coming into different experiences and celebrations and opportunities to collaborate and connect, where it's not like, okay, we're waving our and beating our hands on the table saying you must come in, but you're coming into the office for fear of missing out and for the excitement of the programming that's going to be there. And the opportunity to have those shared experiences with your colleagues.
Great points. So maybe as we move toward wrapping up, I'll ask each of you, share a couple of final thoughts, maybe some questions that that folks can take back into their next board meeting. Who wants to kick us off?
I'll start, Robin. I think that one of the most important questions the board can ask is, what's being done to ensure that those people who have been identified as potential leaders in 3+ years are getting the development now so they can be ready in 12 to 18 months? And along with that question, have they been told that they've been identified as a high potential future leader? All too often, there are lots of discussions that go on about people, and it's never communicated to them how important they are. So I think the board needs to ask about that.
That's great. Mike?
Yeah, I've got a couple here. How do we think about our shared values, and how do we communicate those shared values and gain alignment there? What role does this CHRO play kind of in the shaping of our future culture? I think is part of it. How do we embrace but yet de-risk any of the impacts of AI into the workforce? I think is important for us to think through. And then also, again, I'm just reminded as I was out in the Bay Area this week, what does collaboration look like in the future? From a board perspective, from an internal perspective, what does collaboration look like? And then how do we ensure that we've got the necessary skills to be successful in that particular environment?
Fantastic. Rosalind.
Yeah, I think a lot of great things have been said, so sort of hard to add to that list. But I mean, I do think that there is this need for this new kind of workforce planning and thinking about, what are the competencies and capabilities, and just continuing to stay current on that. New needs to think about investments, and are those investments optimal? And then how do you continue to keep kind of skills current and fresh? So, I mean, those are just huge hot buttons across the talent landscape right now.
Right. And maybe would it be possible, because I really thought that those questions that you had on the second of the two slides, NACD team, I don't know if it's possible to share that slide back up, but maybe we could take a closer look at those questions as well, because I thought they were good, maybe for boards to keep in mind, and we could maybe, Roz, you could kind of talk us through those, and then we could
Sure.
reflect on those a little before we wrap up.
Sure. So if we acknowledge that, it's not the world it used to be, right? We're like, we look for a job, we put on our suit, we interview, we stayed there for 5, 7, 10 more years, right? People are job jumping, they're not sticking around anymore. So if we understand that, are we really prepared for finding people, getting them productive, keeping what we need for the amount of time we need it, but knowing that people are just going to move around more, and making sure that we're ready for that? We know that we are on the tipping point of a major evolution and revolution in terms of how technology is going to change ways of working, and really need to make sure that the overall integrated experience around how that ties together with all the solutions that we use as part of our work, and also understand what the risks are, right? Because we know that there is a huge amount of risk in terms of how decisions are made, and the security and proprietary information and all of that stuff that needs to be addressed through this. In terms of productivity, again, there's kind of like this fear factor around, well, how much is changing and how can we sustain all that change? But are we going to make sure that we're embracing this and we're leaning into what is really productive and being able to measure productivity? I mean, that's always, I think, been, sort of a huge unacknowledged gap, that we haven't had a good method to measure and evaluate continued improvement in productivity. We need to treat our investments in people, the mix of the compensation elements, the benefit elements, the learning, the overall environmental things, and really make sure that it addresses their priorities. We've got more diverse life and career stages. We've got, such a range of needs, and how do we make sure that we are listening to employees about those rewards and that they're working? We have to acknowledge that the people are not necessarily going to be in an office 5 days anymore. Maybe some companies that we work with are mandating that, but there is going to be a further globalization of work, as a push for working from anywhere. The compliance world is definitely not with that. We want to make sure that the space that we sponsor, real estate is still the second biggest investment after people, is really driving that kind of destination into somewhere that people are excited for. And then finally, again, sort of going back to what you heard Mike say many times, it's just like it's really about the culture, right? And we really have to make sure that the behaviors, the experiences of how we treat each other, how we experience work, is going to be effective and more agile, and able to help people navigate a much more changing world of work. So yeah, you're right. There are some really fun ones on here, and good kind of conversation starters as you think about preparing for your own meetings, and where are the specific sort of issues and gaps that you want to address here.
Well, thanks for that. And as we mentioned in the chat, we'll get NAC will get a PDF version of this slide and the previous slide shared around as part of the follow-up email, which will have some other resources, some articles and related reading to check out. With that, please join me in thanking Kerrie, Mike, and Rosalind. Great discussion. Really appreciate everyone's also active participation in the chat. Great questions, great perspectives shared. With that, Ted, I will hand things back over to you to close us out today.
Super. Thanks a million to Robin and to the team for today's discussion. It was really, really fantastic. Look out for our next EY session, which will be in the autumn. And once again, a big thanks to all our sponsors.